The sign was easy to miss, rusted and half covered in overgrown brush. Woodpine Forest Trail, use at your own risk. The words barely clung to the weather-beaten wood, a grim reminder of the place's forgotten past. Jessie Harper hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn backpack. Something about that sign felt wrong. Not just neglected, but wrong. Jessie was no stranger to isolated places. As a travel blogger specializing in off-the-beaten-path locations, she had spent years exploring abandoned towns, derelict buildings, and trails no one dared walk anymore. This trip wasn't just for her audience. It was personal. Her father had grown up near this forest, and he used to tell her stories about it when she was little. But one story had stood out: how his best friend went missing in these woods when they were both teenagers, never to be found. Before we dive deeper into this chilling tale, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story that'll send shivers down your spine. Ready? Let's head into the darkness. The official search lasted weeks, but nothing was ever discovered. No tracks, no clues. Her father had always believed the forest held secrets, something darker than just the dangers of getting lost. He never liked to talk about it, brushing it off as childish imagination when Jessie pressed him for details. Now, with her father gone, Jessie felt a pull she couldn't ignore. She needed answers, not just for him, but for herself. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted her cap and stepped onto the trail. Jessie was the kind of person who thrived on curiosity, but unlike others who sought thrills for attention, she was drawn by the need to understand the unknown. She had always been a skeptic, skeptical of the supernatural, skeptical of urban legends, skeptical even of herself sometimes. She liked facts, things she could see and touch. That's what made her good at her job. She didn't jump at shadows. Still, something about Woodpine Forest made her uneasy. It wasn't just the stillness, it was the silence beneath the stillness. Forests were never truly quiet. They were alive with the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds. But here, there was none of that. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the dry leaves and the occasional creak of ancient trees bending slightly in the wind. The air smelled wrong too. Damp, yes, but with a faint metallic tang like rusted iron. She told herself it was probably from nearby mineral deposits or the decaying leaves underfoot. Yet the scent clung stubbornly to the back of her throat, refusing to be ignored. She paused to take a sip from her water bottle, letting her eyes scan her surroundings. The deeper she went, the denser the forest became. Thick roots twisted across the ground like skeletal fingers, waiting to trip her up. Old, gnarled trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled in a canopy so thick it nearly blocked out the midday sun. Shafts of light pierced through here and there, but they only served to create long shadows that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. A breeze rustled through the underbrush, carrying with it a soft whispering sound. Jessie froze. It was faint, too faint to be words, but it was there, threading through the silence like a needle. She scanned the woods, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Shaking it off, she pressed on, more out of stubbornness than confidence. After about an hour, she found herself standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center, half buried in the earth, was a crumbling stone well. Its circular opening was framed by moss-covered stones, and a rickety wooden frame hung precariously over it, the remains of what had once been a rope and pulley system dangling uselessly. Jessie approached cautiously, pulling out her camera. As she moved closer, she noticed something odd. The air around the well felt colder, sharper, as if it belonged to a different season entirely. The metallic tang was stronger here too. She knelt down, brushing away some of the moss to get a better look. Strange symbols were etched into the stones, symbols she didn't recognize. Her heart gave an involuntary lurch. She wasn't sure why, but something about those symbols made her skin crawl. Maybe it was the way the lines twisted and looped back on themselves, forming patterns that didn't quite make sense. A sudden snap of a twig behind her made her whip around, heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. No answer. Just the wind brushing through the leaves. She waited a moment longer, then turned back to the well. As she reached out to snap another photo, she heard it again, that faint, almost imperceptible whispering sound. Only this time it was closer. She stood up quickly, scanning the tree line. Something felt off. The forest didn't just feel silent anymore. It felt expectant, as if it was waiting for her to make a wrong move. "I'm just imagining things," she muttered under her breath, trying to calm herself. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, too tall to be a person, slipped between the trees, vanishing before she could fully register what she'd seen. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Jessie picked up her pace, moving quickly but carefully down the trail. The whispering followed her, growing louder with each step. It wasn't just the wind. There was a rhythm to it now, an unnatural cadence that sent chills racing down her spine. She tried to focus on the path ahead, ignoring the creeping sense of dread clawing at her mind. But the farther she went, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was watching her. The trail twisted sharply, leading her into another dense thicket. The shadows seemed to close in tighter here, the light filtering through the trees, turning an ominous shade of gray. Jessie's breath came in shallow bursts as the whispering grew louder still, surrounding her from all sides. Suddenly, the path opened up into another clearing. At first glance, it looked identical to the one she just left. Same gnarled trees, same tangled roots. But there was no well in this one. Instead, at the center stood a single withered tree, its bark blackened and split as if struck by lightning. Jessie's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. She had been walking in a straight line. There was no way she could have circled back. And yet, here she was, standing in a clearing that felt all too familiar. She glanced around, trying to get her bearings, but the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. No landmarks, no sounds, just the whispering wind and the oppressive silence beneath it. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she kept a small flashlight. She hesitated. The daylight was already fading, casting long shadows that flickered like living things. She didn't want to be out here after dark, but something told her that turning on a light might not be the best idea. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out her phone instead, checking the map app. No signal. Of course. Jessie was about to put the phone away when she noticed something strange on the screen. The battery indicator, which had been nearly full that morning, was now blinking red. Before she could react, the phone flickered and shut off completely. Her heart sank. Somewhere behind her, a twig snapped. Jessie spun around, eyes scanning the darkening woods. The whispering had stopped, but now there was something worse. Click, click, click. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. It echoed through the trees, steady and deliberate, like something metallic tapping against stone. Jessie's grip tightened on her flashlight, her mind racing. The sound was getting closer. Click, click, click. And then she remembered something her father had once said, long ago, in a voice trembling with fear. If you ever hear clicking sounds in woodpine forest, don't turn on the light. Jessie stood frozen in the clearing, her breath shallow, ears straining to make sense of the sound. The clicking wasn't loud, but it was steady, coming from somewhere deep in the forest, yet creeping closer with each passing second. She didn't move, but her mind raced, trying to find logic in the noise. It could be an animal, she thought, maybe a bird or an insect. But no bird sounded like that, and it didn't explain why the whispering had stopped so suddenly. Then it hit her. This was how things always began in stories she'd heard before. First, it was something subtle. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until you realized too late that you were being hunted. But this wasn't a story, she reminded herself. This was real, and she was standing alone in the middle of a forest that didn't feel entirely normal. The clicking grew faint for a moment, then stopped altogether. Jessie exhaled, forcing herself to stay calm. But even as the sound faded, the cold air around her felt heavier, like it was pressing against her skin. She needed to move. Standing still only made the fear worse, feeding her imagination with terrible possibilities. Also, she realized something else. She was still heading deeper into the forest, even though she hadn't planned to go this far. The trail had twisted and curved so many times that it no longer felt like a simple path to follow. But turning back didn't feel like an option either. She took another cautious step forward, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots sounding unnaturally loud. The shadows were longer now, stretching out like claws across the forest floor. But the tree canopy was still too thick for her to tell how much daylight remained. She figured she had maybe an hour before dusk. Then something moved just beyond the tree line. Jessie stopped again, heart pounding. It was quick, like a flicker of motion in the corner of her vision. She turned her head slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing. No movement, no sound. "But I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And she had. There was no mistaking the way the branches had shifted, as though something had passed through them. Jessie swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The forest had been playing tricks on her since she arrived, but this felt different. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. Something was out there. She kept walking, faster now, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The tension was unbearable, like a coiled spring inside her chest, ready to snap at any moment. But she told herself to focus. She had to stay logical, grounded. Fear only made people reckless, and recklessness got people hurt, or worse. 10 minutes later, Jessie noticed something strange ahead, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. It was odd, because the sun shouldn't have been shining through like that. The canopy above was too dense, and the light didn't look natural. It flickered slightly, as though coming from a fire. But who would have a fire out here? As she drew closer, she saw that it wasn't a fire at all. It was a lantern, hanging from a low branch, its glass smudged with grime. The light it cast was dim, but it was enough to illuminate the area around it. Beneath the lantern was a crude wooden bench, weathered and splintered by age. Jessie stared at the scene, unsure what to make of it. The lantern looked old, like something out of another century, and the bench seemed even older. But what struck her most was how out of place it all felt, like a piece of the past frozen in time. Then she noticed something else. There was someone sitting on the bench. The figure was hunched over, cloaked in shadow. Jessie took a cautious step closer, her heart racing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The figure didn't move at first. Then, slowly, it lifted its head, revealing a face that was pale and gaunt, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. The person looked old, too old to be out here alone. Jessie's mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe they were lost, or maybe they lived nearby. But something about their expression made her uneasy. "Are you okay?" she asked, keeping her distance. The person didn't answer right away. They just stared at her, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, they said, "You shouldn't have come here." Jessie felt a chill run down her spine. "Why?" "They don't like it when people come too close," the figure continued, their voice trembling. "They don't want to be seen." Jessie frowned. "Who's they?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned their gaze toward the forest, as though listening for something. Jessie followed their gaze but saw nothing, just the same endless expanse of trees and shadows. But the fear in the person's eyes was unmistakable. "I think you should leave," the figure said after a moment, their voice urgent. "Before it's too late." Jessie hesitated. Every instinct told her to turn around and walk away, but something kept her rooted in place. Maybe it was the way the person spoke, like they knew something she didn't. Or maybe it was her own stubbornness, the part of her that refused to back down without answers. But before she could say anything else, the clicking sound returned, louder this time, echoing through the forest like a series of sharp, deliberate taps. Jessie's breath caught in her throat. The figure on the bench tensed, their eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," they whispered. "Don't let them see you." Then, without warning, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. Jessie fumbled for her flashlight, her fingers trembling as she switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but the figure on the bench was gone, vanished without a trace. Jessie spun around, shining the light in every direction, but there was no sign of them. Panic surged through her veins. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing: she couldn't stay here. She turned and started running, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each step. The clicking sound followed her, growing louder, more insistent. It was everywhere now, surrounding her, closing in. But something was wrong. The forest didn't look the same anymore. The trees seemed taller, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The path she had been following was gone, replaced by a tangled mass of roots and underbrush. Jessie's breathing was ragged, her legs burning with each step. She had no idea where she was going, but she didn't care. She just needed to get away. But then she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. A voice, faint and distant, calling her name. Jessie. She turned, shining the flashlight in the direction of the voice. But there was no one there. Just trees and shadows. Jessie, the voice called again, closer this time. It was soft, almost familiar, but twisted in a way that made her skin crawl. Then she realized something horrifying. It was her father's voice. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of it. Her father was dead. He had been dead for years. But the voice was unmistakable, echoing through the darkness like a cruel joke. Jessie. She backed away, her mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then the voice changed, becoming deeper, more distorted. Come closer, it said, the words slurring together in an unnatural way. Jessie turned and ran, not daring to look back. The forest blurred around her, the clicking sound merging with the voice until it became a maddening cacophony. She didn't know how long she ran, but eventually, she stumbled into another clearing. This one was different. At the center stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and split, branches stretching out like skeletal arms, and beneath the tree, half buried in the earth, was something that made Jessie's blood run cold. It was a stone well, identical to the one she had seen earlier. But this time, there was no lantern, no figure on the bench, just the well, waiting silently in the darkness. And then she noticed the symbols etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as she looked at them. Jessie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She didn't know what those symbols meant, but she knew one thing: they weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. Before she could react, the clicking sound stopped. The forest fell silent. And then, from somewhere deep within the well, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. Jessie took a step back, her mind racing with fear and confusion. But before she could move any further, the whisper turned into a voice, deep, distorted, and unmistakably familiar. Jessie, it said again, echoing from the depths of the well. And in that moment, Jessie realized something that changed everything. She wasn't alone in the forest. Something had been waiting for her all along. Jessie's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as she stood before the well. The darkness around her wasn't just an absence of light. It felt thick, pressing, as though the forest itself was trying to crush her under its weight. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, but her body remained frozen in place. She clutched the flashlight tightly, its weak beam trembling against the encroaching void. But the light didn't matter anymore. It couldn't pierce the kind of darkness that surrounded her now. The whispering from the well grew louder, rising and falling in a strange, monotonous rhythm that made her skin crawl. But then, just when she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the whispering stopped. Silence fell over the clearing, heavy and suffocating. Jessie took a shaky step back, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she thought, hoped, that whatever horror lurked within the well had retreated. Then something shifted. A low, grinding sound echoed from the well's depths, like stone scraping against stone. Jessie's flashlight flickered, its beam faltering as the air grew colder. She shivered, her breath visible in the freezing air. But it wasn't just the cold that made her tremble. It was the feeling that something was coming. Also, the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as though something deep below was stirring. Jessie clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. Fear clawed at her mind, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had come too far to lose control now. But then, before she could take another step, a voice echoed from the well. You were never meant to leave. Jessie's blood turned to ice. The voice was wrong in every way, low, hollow, and layered, as though more than one being spoke at once. But what made it worse was how familiar it sounded. It wasn't just any voice, it was her own, distorted and twisted beyond recognition. She took another step back, her pulse racing. This couldn't be real. None of it could be real. But as she looked around, she realized that reality itself seemed to be unraveling. The trees no longer stood still. Their twisted branches writhed and shifted like grasping hands. The ground beneath her feet seemed to stretch and contract, as though the forest was breathing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. She turned, shining her flashlight toward the trees. For a moment, she saw nothing but shadows. But then the shadows moved, forming shapes that weren't entirely human. Figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes emerged from the darkness, their forms flickering as though they weren't entirely solid. Jessie's heart pounded in her chest, fear threatening to overwhelm her. But she couldn't give in. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. Also, she couldn't ignore the well. Something about it called to her, drawing her closer despite the terror it filled her with. She took a step toward it, then another, her flashlight flickering with each step. The whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. But then she heard something else, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound, echoing from all around her. The same sound that had haunted her since she first entered the forest. It grew louder with each passing second, surrounding her, closing in. Jessie spun around, shining her flashlight in every direction, but she saw nothing. And then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Jessie fell, the world spinning around her as she plunged into darkness. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her body, but she forced herself to move, gasping for breath. She found herself lying on cold, damp stone, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Above her, the well's opening loomed far out of reach, a faint circle of light in the darkness. She was trapped, deep beneath the forest with no way out. But then she heard it again. That voice, low and hollow, echoing from the shadows. You were always meant to find this place. Jessie scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. The air felt heavier down here, pressing against her chest like an unseen weight. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting and twisting in ways that made no sense. Also, the clicking sound was louder now, echoing from the darkness beyond. Jessie shone her flashlight ahead, the beam barely penetrating the gloom. But as she stepped forward, she realized that the sound wasn't coming from one place, it was coming from everywhere. Panic surged through her veins. She had to find a way out. She couldn't stay here. But as she moved deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder and the shadows grew darker. The walls seemed to close in around her, the narrow passage twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. Then she saw something up ahead, a faint glimmer of light. Jessie quickened her pace, hope flaring in her chest. But as she drew closer, she realized that the light wasn't natural. It flickered and pulsed like a dying ember, casting an eerie glow on the stone walls. She reached the source of the light and found herself standing before a large, circular chamber. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, covered in strange, shifting symbols. And above the altar, suspended in midair, was a small, glowing orb, its light pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Jessie stared at the orb, a sense of dread washing over her. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was important. Somehow she felt that everything, the forest, the well, the whispering, was connected to this object. But before she could move, the voice spoke again. You were always part of this. Jessie turned, her flashlight beam sweeping across the chamber. But there was no one there, just shadows and echoes. Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to think. She had to find a way out. Also, she had to understand. Then it hit her. The orb wasn't just an object. It was a doorway, a connection to something beyond this world. And somehow, she was connected to it. She didn't know how or why, but she felt it deep in her bones. She took a step toward the altar, then another. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows closing in around her. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she reached out to touch the orb, the clicking sound grew deafening, echoing through the chamber like 1,000 tiny claws scraping against stone. The light from the orb flared, blinding her, and for a moment everything was silent. Then the world shifted. Jessie found herself standing in the clearing again. The forest eerily silent around her. The well was gone, the lantern and bench nowhere in sight. Everything looked normal, too normal. But she knew that nothing was the same. She glanced down at her hand, which still tingled from touching the orb. But there was nothing there. No mark, no sign of what had happened. Then she heard it again, that faint, rhythmic clicking sound, echoing from the shadows. It was distant now, but she knew it would return. She knew that whatever she had awakened in the forest wasn't gone. It was waiting. Jessie took a deep breath, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. But she didn't run. She couldn't. She had come too far to turn back now. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, she realized something that chilled her to the bone. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was part of the forest now, and it would never let her go. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying stories that will haunt your thoughts long after the lights go out. Share your theories in the comments. What do you think Jessie unleashed in the forest? And remember, the next time you hear clicking sounds in the dark, don't turn on the light. Stay curious, stay brave, and I'll see you in the next story.